0212, message and order approving a supplemental appropriation of $1,388,154 for the Boston Public Schools to cover the impact of the collective bargaining agreement between Transdev and its bus drivers on the city's transportation contract with the vendor Transdev. And Docket 0213, message in order to reduce the FY19 appropriation for the reserve for collective bargaining by $1,388,154 to provide funding for the Boston Public Schools to cover the impact of the collective bargaining agreement between Transdev and its bus drivers. I'd like to ask folks in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. Remind folks that this is a public hearing, is being recorded and broadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. At the conclusion of the department's presentation and questions from my colleagues, we will take public testimony. There is a sign-in sheet to my left. We ask that you sign in, provide your name, any affiliation, and mark the box if you do wish to testify. We will also take written testimony in the form of email at ccc.wm@boston.gov and by snail mail as well. I am joined by two of my colleagues to my left in order of their arrival. My friend from South Boston, District Councilor Ed Flynn, and to my right, my friend and colleague from Jamaica Plain, Councilor Matt O'Malley. So with that, I want to welcome John and Ed to the chamber. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is John Hanlon. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Boston Public Schools. I'm joined by Ed Pesch, Assistant Director of Finance in the Transportation Department of Boston Public Schools. I'll note that in the week leading up to St. Patrick's Day, I enjoyed the three city councilors here this morning. Thank you for donning your green ties, I guess. Don't have mine on.
It's the Irish flag raising today, too.
So just to be clear, what we're presenting on today is a contract that's not technically between the City of Boston and the bus drivers, the United Steelworkers, local bus drivers. This is actually a contract between Transdev and the bus drivers. Negotiations are coordinated between Transdev and the bus drivers, but because the bus drivers do make up a large workforce within Boston Public Schools, albeit through a contractor, we do need to come through City Council and School Committee to have supplemental funding approved to support the cost of that contract. The contract itself was negotiated last summer and into the fall, and I'm joined again by Ed Pesch from Transportation to walk through a very brief presentation. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just to kind of refresh everyone's memory on the different relationships here, just to reiterate a little bit of what John said. So Boston Public Schools is in a contract with Transdev, who operates our entire transportation system, and they are the employer of the United Steelworkers Local 8751. So due to the structure of our contract, like we've talked about before, it's a pass-through contract. Every dollar that Transdev spends, the city reimburses for. So Transdev does all the bargaining, per our contract with the bus drivers union. So Transdev and the school bus drivers union reached an agreement on September 14th, 2018. And that bargaining unit is approximately 870 total members with about 649 driving daily. That agreement is a 3-year agreement, which started on July 1, retroactive July 1, 2018, and will run through June 30th, 2021. The school rate increases because there's a difference between what a driver gets paid for school rate and then charter rate, which is what a driver gets paid for charter work, so athletics and field trips. The school rate increases are going to be 2% each year, so 2% in FY19, 2% in FY20, and another 2% in FY21. So the total cost of the entire contract over those 3 years is $6.8 million, and the supplemental that we're here today is $1.4 million.
Great. And I don't know if you'd have this, but do we have the balance in the collective bargaining reserve at this time?
Do not.
Yeah, I'll get that from the CFO then. Well, one thing that jumped out at me in reviewing some of the material is it says in FY 2019, 20 drivers suspended, DCF investigations and accident review. Some employees have been long-term leave and collecting benefits since before 2013. 50 haven't driven since before 2013. They do not collect a salary, but collect a life insurance benefit of $175,000 per year. And we had a little discussion before the hearing, but on the record, can you explain how that benefit works? Who pays for it? How can I get on it? But so, all kidding aside, that seems like a pretty generous benefit.
Yep. So there are 50 employees who haven't worked for Transdev. At the transition of contracts between First Student to Transdev in 2013, there was an agreement, or my understanding, there was an agreement made that made all employees under First Student and prior contractors an employee of Transdev, and in turn, Boston Public Schools. With that, there's a condition in the CBA that says that any employee on approved leave can collect this life insurance benefit. So the total cost of that life insurance benefit is for premiums for, I don't even know if it's all 50 are actually enrolled in that program, but for those 50 long-term leave is $175,000 per year in total. So not $175,000 per person per year, but as a total sum.
Total sum and we don't really know what the circumstances. We just inherited these folks from even before our contracting with Transdev.
Correct, and because when you transition contracts, there are different systems in play and different kind of employee policies under First Student than versus Transdev. We don't even know to be certain how long before 2013. I mean, they could have been. First Student was here from, the early 2000s, so right. It could be, we're talking substantial years since any of these people have driven for, the City of Boston and Boston Public Schools.
Right, and it also mentions something about severance. A 30-year employee gets it, so are they not technically in the City of Boston pension system?
Correct.
Okay.
So there are two different things in terms of, or three different things in terms of retirement. At the end of someone's employment after at least 30 years working in the Boston Public Schools operation, so that's through many contractors in most cases, a driver can collect a severance package based on how many years of service. So it's how many years of service, and in this current contract, it's $1,000 per year of service as a severance package you leave with. Throughout their employment, they also can enroll in a 401k plan with whoever the contractor is at the time, and there is a company match. So the Transdev will match a portion of salary into the 401k. So they'll be collecting this 401k post retirement, and then the last thing is an OPEB, so an other post-employment benefit. So it's a medical kind of healthcare plan for retirees.
Right. And that's all handled through Transdev?
All handled through Transdev, right. Paid for by Transdev, and then us.
Right. And then lastly, and I want my colleagues to jump in, much has been talked about the management fee part of this contract and how that's negotiated and where we arrive at that, and are there any penalties, for example, when school started, a lot of late arrivals and such, do we have any flexibility or any mechanism to kind of get compensated for those kinds of situations?
So the structure of the current contract has a fixed management fee, which started at, when Transdev first got here, at $2.75 million and increases by CPI adjustment every year. So, it could be between 2% and 4% every year. It's current year, it's around $2.9 million, and that's fixed. So they will always get that regardless of how well they perform.
Right.
On top of that, in our contract, there is $1 million kind of incentive-based variable management fee that if Transdev does well, they kind of have access to this $1 million. So at the beginning of the year, we stand up $1 million, balance, and then as they perform, poorly, we kind of draw down from that. So throughout the course of this contract, we've never paid out that $1 million fee. So that's, it was, the original intention was they have access to this $1 million fee, so it's going to drive them and incentivize them to do well. Unfortunately, because of certain, performance metrics, they've never received that, and we've never paid that out.
Gotcha, okay. And I'm sorry, lastly, looking at the historical data too, on our yearly transportation cost, where did I see that? So 2015, 109 million, 2016, 114, 2017, 119, and again, approximately about 5% increase per year is at our calculation. Is that kind of what we're going to expect going forward? And the reason I asked that is several years ago, actually, when Mayor Marty Walsh came in, we were attempting to put the 7th graders on the 7th and 8th, and we did more of a phase-in. We, took the 8th graders off 1 year, and we were supposed to reap significant benefits from that, if I remember, like millions. So if we hadn't done that, obviously, I'm assuming that this 5% a year could have been a lot more. Can you speak to that at all?
Mm-hmm. So one thing to highlight is the growth that we've seen over the last couple of years has actually been shrinking. So from FY15 to FY16, we saw a rate of growth of 5.3%, and our current year projection, so 2019 compared to 2018, is 2.4%. So while we haven't been, decreasing our spending, we've been, closing that gap, which is a huge accomplishment. In terms of, future, the way I put it at a previous hearing was if every single student lived at the same address they did this year and was going to the same exact school and every single route was the same, we would likely spend more next year, and that's because of the way this budget and what we pay for is structured. It's a workforce of six different union forces, which all have, I think right now, all have 2% increases built into there. So there's going to be, inflationary wage increases. And then what's different from our BPS budget versus almost all other BPS budgets and city department budgets is we're hit with, well, they're not pensions, they're 401ks, health insurance, and all those things, regardless of what's happening, is likely going to grow every year.
Right, great.
And, Councillor, if you don't mind, I'd point out just a couple other things in addition to that. The move to 7th and 8th graders on the MBTA predates both myself and Ed at Boston Public Schools. What I can tell you, though, is that the savings from that was likely marginal at best at first, simply because in order to truly extract significant savings from that type of move, you would have needed a large number of buses that solely transported 7th and 8th graders, and then you no longer need those buses. But in reality, because our buses are fully integrated across all grades, across all needs, what have you, the savings from that are actually much more reduced, because you may have had a bus of 20 students, 3 of whom were 7th and 8th graders. You still have that bus of 17 students the next year, and probably 20 as we find other children to pick up along the route. One other thing that I would point out is the cost increases that Ed mentions. You're used to this from hearing budget presentations from across all city departments. There isn't a city department here that would present a net savings from year to year, simply because wages, benefits, especially in our case, benefits that we have to pay for in our budget that other departments don't. Other line items, they'll continue to go up in cost year to year, no matter how aggressive our savings goals are, which they typically are year to year.
Right. And in the city, to your point, the city in general is labor intensive and personnel heavy, and obviously those costs go up year to year. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to John and Ed for being here today. And I had a few questions. Is there anything in the contract as it relates to enabling bus drivers to get access to affordable childcare?
Not that I know of.
No, not that
Not that I know
no,
of.
not that we can speak to, you know.
That's a big issue. I know the administration is certainly focused on access to childcare, but going forward, could we try to at least engage different unions or different contractors in a discussion about how we can offer access to childcare?
What I will say is that while we don't, like, the contract doesn't promote paying for access to childcare, there is a leave category called childcare leave, where a driver can take a take a leave because of childcare purposes, and then return to his work. So while we're not providing access to the childcare service, we are providing, access for the person to take a leave and go do that.
Yeah, that's a major issue that I'm going to try to focus on, is how we can get more workers, whether they're contractors or city employees, or people working in the city, better access to childcare. It's so expensive that we have to start working on that issue, especially on a lot of these contracts. So going forward, maybe we can have a discussion about that issue.
Yeah, and Councillor, one last thing that I'd point out too is that oftentimes items end up in contracts because of the wants, needs, demands of the two different parties. And as of right now, the average age of our drivers is about 60. We don't have the number of drivers within our workforce who have sort of childcare demands as maybe they once did. I think with a different, under a different set of circumstances, you might see more of a push for that through collective bargaining to have something like that introduced in a contract. But to date, that has not been a major concern, aside from the child care leave that Ed mentioned.
Okay. The other issue is, I know, reading the contract, you are drug testing and alcohol testing. Could you talk a little about that? I served 25 years in the Navy, and I had random drug testing frequently for 25 years. And I certainly agree with alcohol and drug testing for employees, especially as it's done through the collective bargaining process. But can you talk about this program and maybe focus a little bit on, as we almost head towards the legalization of marijuana, what impact will that have on drug testing?
So what I can speak to is, all our drivers go through a drug and alcohol, screening and testing, at hire, and then also if they are ever involved in an accident. I believe regardless of the severity of the accident, they have to get a drug and alcohol test, but I'll come back and verify that. And I'm not sure in terms, federal or state law and mandates, kind of that world, but we can get back to you.
In my job as a probation officer, I had to randomly test my probationers, and many would be tested positive for marijuana, which would stay in your system for 30 days. How would that impact a bus driver that may be in a minor accident or another accident? He's tested positive for marijuana, but he may have used it, a week before the accident happened. He may not be under the influence of marijuana at that time, but it's still in his system. How are we going to deal with that issue? Because eventually it could come out.
Yeah. What I can say to that is I'll review with Transdev, because since they are Transdev employees, Transdev has a whole employee handbook and employee conduct, and I'll just make sure that I get that exact terminology and kind of what the policy is internally for them for you, because I'm not sure how it works, especially in the transit industry.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add is that Transdev does have with the bus drivers a similar to the City of Boston, a gradual progressive discipline policy such that the first offense is typically a written warning, if not sort of a verbal warning first, and then it progresses from there. And then typically after, I believe, 12 months.
It resets with 13, I think.
after 13 months, it resets, so the slate is wiped clean. It could be that in an offense like that, which we can look up for you, but in an offense like that, accident, they're tested positive for marijuana, maybe it came days before, maybe it came earlier that morning. It could be that they just hit the next step in progressive discipline. We'd have to check on that, though, and report back to you.
Okay, yeah, I just think as we do more union contracts over the next months and years, that we're going to really have to have a policy on, marijuana and what impact it will have if marijuana is still in your system, and you may not be under the influence of marijuana. So maybe I'll work with Neil and the administration on exactly what we can do or can't do on that issue. Any provisions in there on bus drivers that might be veterans? And I know you're giving they've earned some time off because of military leave, but anything else that you're doing in terms of helping bus drivers that are veterans?
So our contract with Transdev, and I'm not sure if there's anything in the Transdev contract with United Steelworkers, but our contract with Transdev had asked that 60% of total employees, so not just drivers, total employees were either veterans or City of Boston residents.
Okay.
And I'm not sure kind of how that all played out, 6 years later, but we can see, demographic-wise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to follow up, John, first on the chairman's question, because I didn't quite understand it right, but this is in relation to the 35 out of 750 drivers were on suspension, correct? Or I guess it's for both of you guys.
Depends the day. So on average, any given day, it's probably falls between 25 and 30.
Oh, okay. So maybe so we're looking at about 4%, 4.5%.
Sure, yeah.
And is that, forgive my ignorance, is that higher? Is that average? Is that normal?
I'm not sure, actually.
Okay.
So when you kind of drill into those 25 or 30, about 20 of them are tied up in what's called the Accident Review Committee, or with DCF cases, so a 51A has been filed against
Yep.
them. So we're kind of at the mercy of those processes before we can get these guys back on the road. Obviously, if there's minor reasons that a driver is suspended, we're looking to turn that around as fast as possible.
So it could be, so I want to talk about those 20, but then those other 5 to 10, that could be someone's chronically late, gets a 2-day suspension,
Yeah.
to sort of clean his or her act up. Okay, so of those 20, drivers are suspended because of DCF investigation, so that's 51A, that's presumably a parent or a teacher files a claim that they are not treating children correctly, essentially, thereabouts.
There are a variety of reasons, but yes.
Or accident review, meaning there's an accident and correctly Transdev wants to remove that driver from the streets until there can be a thorough investigation.
Correct.
And of those, so this is, I guess, the statistic that the chairman referenced, and I just want clarity on. According to my notes, some employees have been on long-term leave and collecting benefits since before 2013, 6 years ago.
Yes.
50 haven't driven since before 2013.
Separate things. So suspended with pay, those 30 odd drivers,
Yeah.
are current active drivers. The other 50 with the $175,000 life insurance benefit is kind of a separate category.
But we have 50 individuals who have not driven a bus in 6 years, at least 6 years. And they're collecting, what does that mean? They're collecting $175,000 life
So
insurance
they're not
policy?
collecting, is we're on the hook to pay the premiums, which amount to $175,000 a year in a life insurance benefit. So
Per person?
No, collectively as a whole.
For 50 people?
Correct.
So that's, forgive my math, but that's, John did better in math at Latin school than I did. That's $3,300 a year per person.
It's a lot.
Well, but it's a lot better than 175. So it's so $3,000. These people are getting $3,000 a year.
So they're not getting, we're paying $3,000-ish per person to hold this policy.
It's a life
In the
insurance
event
policy,
that
so if they
I
pass away,
see.
then
The insurance
the
company would-
insurance company pays it out. It's simply insurance policy. So the premium that we have to pay per driver is something in the order of, $37.50 $50
Okay.
per year. That's just simply the premium
I see.
total that we pay per driver. If a driver passes, then we nor Transdev actually pay the driver's family. That comes from the insurance company. But this is something that Transdev and vis-a-vis BPS inherited from before Transdev's time through First
Okay,
Student.
that's helpful.
Just one note too, if you don't mind,
Please.
on the suspended with pay. Last year when we presented before the council, I believe the number was 32, 35 drivers suspended with pay. When we presented a couple weeks ago to City Council on transportation spending through FY19 to date, the average number for this school year is 24. So there have been efforts made between last year to this year to continue to reduce that, some of which beyond our control. But we do continue to work with Transdev to watch that number closely and get drivers either out of the system or back on the road as quickly as possible.
Good, no, I appreciate that, and I know you guys do, and I would urge that continued efforts to drive that number down, and then just to keep an eye on those 50 drivers who haven't been driving since before 2013, even though it works out to whatever, $3,000, that does add up, and it does seem to me that we need to get that number as close to zero as possible. So in the budget, the FY19 proposed transportation budget's $119 million?
The active budget, yeah.
Okay. Yet in 2018, it was $123 million?
That was our total spend.
Spent, I mean, we go through this every year, so
Yes.
we're going to presumably not spend $119 million on budget. It's going to be $5, $6, $7 million more on top of that.
What we presented about a month ago, our current projection is $126.1 million for this year.
Okay. And how many children take the bus to school?
We transport about 26,000 students daily.
Okay. And has that number, the thing that frustrates me a little bit is that student population has been shockingly consistent since I joined this body 9 years ago this November. Has the number of children whom we transport stayed static as well?
Overall, the main decrease that we've seen is when we transitioned the 7th and 8th graders from Yellow School Bus
Yep.
to MBTA. For the most part, we've seen a slight decline, but relatively flat. But the more important thing to note is that even though we might be transporting fewer students, we're transporting to more locations.
Yeah.
So we transport to 228 or 29.
228.
228. And, you know, while BPS enrollment's been flat/shrinking, you know, we don't just transport BPS students. We're doing
No.
private, parochial, charter, so on, out
How
of
m-
district.
And can we get the breakdown on charter, parochial, traditional
So-
BPS?
Yeah, so when we presented here 2 weeks ago, I'd call your attention to slide 4 from that document from 2 weeks ago, and we can forward that presentation to you. But on slide 4, we referenced the students and sites that we serve across different school types. For charter and parochial, for the number of students this year alone, we serve about 5,000 students in charter, about 335 in private parochial, and roughly 200 in private special education placements outside of the city.
That
For
number's
BP.
grown, John, this outside placement.
Yes, yes. Last year was
that's-
194. Before
Yeah.
that, it was lower. I think it was 168 in the not too distant past. So that number does continue to grow,
And
unfortunately.
that's per pupil probably the most expensive I'd venture a guess.
By far the most expensive per pupil, yes. I think the average is about $30,000 per
Wow.
pupil this year.
Okay. Again, I know this is more sort of the policy, and we will have many weeks and months ahead to discuss it. This is more about a collective bargaining. I appreciate you being able to negotiate, working to get someone to the table. I think it does belie concerns that my colleagues have, and I know you guys do too. I mean, this is something I think that we all share concerns about ways of being efficient, getting these costs down, and also getting the best value for our taxpayers in Boston. So I appreciate that. I'll just, in closing, I know it's difficult with the fact that these vehicles spend so much time on the road, but has there been any talk about moving to the electrification of school buses?
Not at this time. It's kind of, to me, it's still a couple of years out in terms of how expensive it is. The current, school bus propane. So been slowly transitioning our fleet from diesel to propane, alternative fuels, which is, much better for the environment, much better for all the people we transport, our monitors, drivers, students, obviously, especially with asthma. So we currently have 247 out of our 726 are propane, and this is a transition that we will continue until they're all propane. But going back to the price, propane school bus can be between 80 and 100,000, and you're looking at an electric bus between 300,000 and 500,000 for one bus. So the technology just isn't there to drive that price down.
Okay.
We're very lucky to have someone on our team named Peter Crossan who has testified in front of City Council before. He's one of the foremost experts on yellow school bus within the state, and he watches the market very closely when it comes to things like this. And as he could tell you, the market's just not there yet to make this transition. But rest assured that when that market reaches the point that we can actually dip into it, we will be a leader in that, just as we were with propane.
Good, thank you. And then finally, what about getting smaller vehicles to both address carbon footprint and offsets, and the fact that we have so many buses? I know not all, but we have so many buses that are filled at a quarter of what they should be.
So this is a question that we've heard quite often, both at City Council, public meetings, school committee, what have you. And what we could tell you is a similar answer to what we've reported in the past. A few different things. Number one, our overall costs won't go down much simply because of the size of the vehicle, because the overall drivers of cost are much more in the driver's wages and benefits. In addition to that, fuel costs aren't much cheaper in a smaller vehicle than they are with a propane-powered yellow school bus. In addition to that, a second very important factor is, while it's easy to see a yellow school bus transporting, say, 2 students at one time in the morning, you might not realize that by the time it gets to the school, it has 28 students on board, and it drops off. And then it could be that on that next trip, it only drives 2 students.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to say, well, that's a trip that could have been done by a van. But what people don't realize is that when it gets to that second school and then has to make its third trip, it's now going to be picking up 38 students. And so actually moving to vans would require a few different things of note. Number one, we would likely need more bus yards. Number two, it would likely drive up our costs because we would lose the flexibility that increased capacity has on our buses. Even if the capacity is not used to its fullest, the fact that the capacity is there for a future trip where you do need the capacity is extremely important and not something that our vans would be able to do. We have smaller buses, our MSs. They look like tiny little matchbox buses that we serve, and we can fit no more than 15 people on one of those buses. If our fleet were made up of those, we would have higher costs, just as if we had many vans that provided the service.
That's a fair point. I'll certainly take your word at that. That makes sense the way you explained it there, John. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. And to your original point, if everybody stayed where they lived year in and year out, it's basically a logistical challenge every year to reroute buses. It's not like the MBTA, they have a set route for the most part. And so I commend your work and, your attention on the details of this contract and how we can get to better efficiency long-term with our transportation costs. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks for your time and attention. Dockets 0212 and 0213, I hereby adjourn this hearing.